Hello. Okay, so I started recording something on my actual camera and it stopped halfway through. So I'm going to try to piece together some of the ideas and things that I was talking about. Basically, I was talking about our world view and how important it is to fit other people into our world view. Often in our culture, and for some time, we have a lot of narcissism as a part of our culture, and I think that narcissism's been on the rise as a result of trauma. People talk about personality disorders, and I know there's many different forms of narcissism. You know, there are different varying degrees of the personality disorder, but I'm talking about it metaphorically as a blanket over our culture, and I will refer to it on an individual characteristic kind of psychology sense as well. So before the CV situation happened, I guess, and before all that, if something happened to somebody else, their friends and family could be there for them, but other than that, not many people are really going to care or give a shit. And it's interesting at this time that it kind of pushes us all to have to think about other people's world, other people's experiences, and other people's like their lives as a sacred thing in our worldview. So like we need to fit that in our worldview now, and that's what's happening with the CV. So aside from all the fear and the manipulation and a lot of the different narratives that have just like sewn themselves in, because once something like that is released as an awareness globally, it takes a life of its own. So even if it started off as an agenda in a manipulative sense, even if it didn't, it's going to take on a life of its own, and it's going to just unfurl like a mad beast, which is kind of what's happening right now. And a lot of us think it's the virus that we're really fearful of, or that we're really scared of. And yeah, it is to a degree. I've been sick. I know how horrible it is, and it's not nice. But I think fundamentally, at the foundation of our fear, it's a fear of not existing. I remember saying years ago when I went through a lot of illness, because I realized the amount of fear every time I got a flare up was so immense because of the anxiety around being unwell, dealing with pain, and the outcome being possibly death. But it wasn't irrational. Like, it was rational in the sense that what I went through was a living hell at times, but it wasn't rational in the sense that the fear didn't make my experience any better. It didn't make it more quality in being better while I was sick. It didn't achieve anything other than to make me feel like I had no value, no ability or independent ability to be able to overcome this, life-threatening illness. So I guess what I'm trying to really get at is what are we actually scared of? Are we scared of, I understand we have a continual memory that's playing, and that's the trauma, and that's the narcissism. The result in our culture of the narcissism comes from trauma. So how does it link to trauma? How does narcissism link to trauma? Well, think about your worldview. And if you're someone who's been through a lot of trauma from a very young age, and say you've been diagnosed with a personality disorder, or you haven't, and you're living with a personality disorder in this world, your perception has been squished to such a view that you can only see very narrowly through your own lens, and you're unable to identify anyone else's needs. You're only able to identify your own needs and how they need to be met. And a narcissist, or someone who uses narcissism and has used that as a pattern, as a way of coping, because they've been forced into a squished version of themselves where they had to shut off any perspectives around anyone else and survive through an experience. It causes someone to condense themselves into an ability, what got them through. But the problem is, what got them through those experiences as a child, as they get older and they realize how they can manipulate, then it becomes a continual outward addiction. You have to continuously use somebody else as a life force to sustain your life force. It's like parasitical consciousness. And it's not the person's fault that they've been through trauma. It's not their fault that they ended up having to have such a squished view that they couldn't actually think, feel, or know anyone else, existed in the picture. But the problem is, when they're an adult, it's their responsibility to be willing to heal it. And unfortunately, with narcissism especially, as its own pattern, it's not really, people that are narcissistic aren't really renowned for doing self-work, because it brings up so much shame and so much trauma for them that it makes it difficult for them to even consider that as an option. So that's one extreme, or more of the individual extreme, of what narcissism is. So when you're talking about narcissism as a cultural flow, or a consciousness within our culture, what it is that people act in certain ways, and then those ways become normalized. And then as those ways become normalized, people start to mimic those behaviors, thinking that that's normal life. That's just the way that you do something. That's not necessarily saying that they're narcissistic. They just haven't actually been able to critically think beyond the experience they're having to recognize that they're not really fitting anyone else in their worldview. So with the CV, with everything that's going on, what we're seeing is everyone having to consider other people's worldview. And I'm not saying that people that are renowned individual narcissistic people are actually doing this. I'm just saying the collective consciousness is having to now fit the collective consciousness into its own worldview, which is huge. And the individual finds it difficult to sometimes assess things on that level, because it feels very overwhelming. So it's an interesting process that's happening, and I've been thinking a lot about it lately, is that we are being forced to have a much bigger worldview of the people within the world. Who would have thought that we would start thinking about other people? And I know that we think we do often, and we do in lots of situations, so I'm not denying our humble human, repetitious, beautiful presence on this planet. But the problem is there's so much sabotage and narcissism as a collective consciousness fog, which is as a result of, it's like shadow work, what I talked about in the last thing. So as a result of the residual trauma that has been not only inflicted on an individual times 7 billion in different forms and different ways, just through being in a human, existence, having a human life, but we're also dealing with a collective consciousness trauma that is a result of the last 5,500 years of a lot of dysfunctional, damaging, violent, abusive mind control techniques that have been applied on the human race as a collective experiment / manipulation, and probably a propelling of our consciousness, because often sometimes we need resistance and challenge and the darkness to help us push forward. If you look at any amazing story that you love watching, any show or series that you love to watch, often it's called a story arc. So from the beginning, a character starts on their journey not knowing anything about that specific thing, but maybe having some type of environmental upbringing in that, and then they go through the peak and they're at the top, and they start to actually have to face their greatest challenges, their greatest demons, and their greatest weakness has had the pressure placed on, and it forces the person to have to transform and go through a cellular metamorphosis. And then we often see that character will fail several times, and as a part of the up and down, they start to develop the consciousness, and then by the end of it, hopefully, they can come to a place of resolution. So I guess we look at the collective consciousness the same way. We're going through this particular blind spot. It's our weakness, which might be narcissism or manipulation, power structures that we've been mimicking and playing out for thousands of years. And maybe it's time to start to even identify that that's a problem, that we can't live in a world with 7 billion people and be the best individuals and not actually acknowledge the collective as a whole. And we can't be truly individual if we can't fit the collective into our consciousness as an awareness. Oh wow, I'm just looking at 2 beautiful butterflies like dancing around together. Wow. So that's really beautiful. Cool. Where am I? Okay, cool. So I guess talking about narcissism worldview. Narcissism is someone's worldview that has become so squished, or collectively or culturally has become so squished, that they can't go or even see that other parts of themselves exist because it's been shut down. And so they go, oh my gosh, I need to take whatever I can. It's that parasitical consciousness that freaks out, doesn't remember that it has the light and the consciousness within to actually self-sustain, because we're all built to be regenerative. That's our body's greatest gift. When we start tinkering and manipulating externally the body, and we started doing that long time ago. We've had genetic, testing and things like that for a long time. Even Atlantis is a big place where people were doing animal splicing with DNA and all that kind of thing. And we're seeing a lot of that stuff happen as a repeat in our consciousness, because we talked about collective and individual shadows. That's the stuff, the shadow material. It's the areas in which we think we need to go externally in our approach to get a very limited outcome based on a very limited perspective in the first place. And that's narcissism. It's thinking about your own agenda so much that you are willing to override every other person on the planet to get to what you want. And the reason I'm even getting into this is because there are people in this planet who have a lot of power that actually operate like that. They have narcissistic personality, disorder or manipulation as a normal part of their upbringing, and they have the power to be able to use that resource as a way of utilizing a consciousness or a reality that suits them more. And so we've got to be really careful in this time that we are not giving our power away externally to the situation, to the government, to the virus. We have to remember, we are self-regenerative. We have the ability to restore our own consciousness through our own choice, our own free will. And if we buy into we have to remember that the shadow is always present. So I talked about that collective and individual shadow. It's always present underneath the surface of things. We might not necessarily recognize it consciously, but it's there playing and, pulling the strings in our lives, and sabotaging and undermining our higher purpose in our lives as a way of hopefully teaching us. But if we don't recognize it in time, or if we don't acknowledge it, then it doesn't teach us. It actually keeps us in the dark. So we are at a cross points as a collective consciousness that is making a decision about what we want and what we will stand for and what we will, what we will commit to. And for me, as a worldview, I want to commit to the worldview that fits every single person on this planet in, and is at the benefit of every single person on this planet, individually and collectively. And I'm not talking about me making a decision because I think what I want for the world is what everyone should have. But that's dictatorship, This is about fitting everyone in your worldview so much that you recognize that whatever is in your absolute truth for you, not for an agenda on anyone else, for you, that is the best thing for everyone. But you're also recognizing micro to macro that you're always connected to the collective. So I think it's an important thing to identify at this time, and it's really important that we are critical in our thought processes around what we're buying into. And we have to be careful of the source. Just because we can't see the source of the original source for certain major events or situations doesn't mean there isn't people that have agenda behind the scenes. And so I guess I'm just saying, I understand there's so many layers to it, and just like life, there's so many layers to it. I'm sitting here talking to you, but I'm also breathing fresh oxygen while I'm watching, the sun go down, while I'm hearing crickets. I'm multidimensional. I'm hearing and experiencing many things at once, and so are you. You're probably could be hearing cars driving past. You could be sitting on the bus right now. So there's so many levels of our even now experience that are unmeasurable, and we just have to be aware that life often seems measurable because we create these structured perceptions, and we buy into maybe a view that only limits us to only seeing our point of view. But we have to, in these times, and what is happening in these times is that people are being encouraged to think about other people and think about how to fit other people's views, and like, you know, how does that affect other, when everything crashes? Like, this seems unbelievable what's happening right now, but what we're seeing is that when things crash, there's always going to be those who take advantage of that, and there's always going to be those who lead that in a negative way, but there's always going to be those amazing people who choose to take up the leadership and step through that and move through that. And I think, for like talking about the worldview again, which is kind of what I'm really trying to bring into awareness, is really sit with where you're at and understand, like, what is your worldview and how do you perceive reality to exist, and who are you amongst this reality? Like, not because of the job that you did, because we're not all working at the moment, or maybe some people have got more time off at the moment so they can start to assess who they are outside of that identity. You know, if you think about it, if you're spending 5 full days a week at an identity which we call a job, and you're spending the other remaining time doing something else, like, it'd be really interesting now that people have more time off to know, like, what is actually, how they see themselves. You know, how do you actually identify where you're at? Are you fitting a lot of people in your worldview, or do you normally live in a view that's only very limited and it's only very like small and squished? And for those people that have personality disorders and are like listening to this right now, I'm not attacking having a personality disorder. I recognize that it comes from a level of trauma to such a degree where it forced someone to have to split apart who they are to cope with the reality. And I understand that it wasn't an easy thing. I'm not gonna, I think there's a lot of blaming, but I think we have to identify that our culture and like our cultural reference is very narcissistic as well. So it doesn't really help people that have been through serious trauma to heal themselves. We don't even see that as an opportunity. We don't even see that as something that's a normal thing. Like, we go to a therapist and that's what we see as healing, but like, it's not a normal part of our culture to be like, oh, our culture is so narcissistic, and then these people have gone through severe trauma, so then they come out of that environment and then they try to survive through narcissistic behavioral tools, which are the only thing they've had access to. I mean, we need to start dismantling a lot of this narcissism within ourselves, because that's the last thing that I really wanted to talk about. Was narcissism out there is an aspect within all of us. We all have a level of narcissism that makes us, that comes from a level of trauma. So I'm not saying we're all selfish. I'm saying we have a level of survival within our consciousness, which has which has kept things out of our view. And often that means we don't have a big worldview in certain areas of our awareness. And so it's just about identifying where the narcissism exists or weeds through your consciousness, where you've been traumatized, where you've had serious scarring, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and starting to address and deal with the shame. You know, because when I talked about shadow stuff, this is exactly the same conversation, but I'm just explaining it in a completely different way. So when you've got that narcissism or that wounding, to be able to acknowledge that that isn't actually you. You're not a selfish. No one is really, like, they may act selfish and they may choose lifetime after lifetime to be a selfish person. But at the core of who they are, they're not a selfish person. They're a unified collective consciousness field that are a part of every aspect. If we decided to, if a person has 1 cancer cell or 5 cancer cells, are we going to kill the whole body because it has 5 cancer cells? Cancer cells are damaged and, you know, mutated cells. They're not functioning at a normal rate. They're not operating at a normal rate. And maybe they are a representation of the narcissism culture that we actually have. Maybe the actual cancer that we have in our world is actually more relative to the narcissism, or reflective of the narcissism that exists as a part of our consciousness at this time, based on trauma and the effects of trauma, which closes in our view and makes it difficult or more difficult to identify that other people exist and that we are actually sharing this reality and consciousness. And I'm not blaming anyone. We're all separated in our consciousness. I'm only talking about this because we are wanting to get to a place where we are able to share the awareness of our consciousness together in full presence, with full respect for every single being as a part of the wave particle dance that we're trying to, or working at, trying to be in alignment with through feeling. So everything is about stepping into our empathic selves. And to do empathic work when you've got narcissism, it creates a conflict, because you've got to heal that wounding to step more into your positive or genuine feeling. And I notice that a lot. I think the last few years I've really been working at clearing and eradicating narcissism from my own consciousness, and removing any predatory consciousness strains within me as well, like where areas where I'm a predator, or areas where I allow predatory behavior. So it's an interesting topic, and there's a lot more angles to it because it's all relating to shadow stuff. But I just feel it's really important to remember, keep your worldview open. Remember that you're experiencing on a personal level trauma, and we're all experiencing on a collective level trauma, and know that we're all going through this together. And the more that we keep keeping each other in the worldview and sharing our feelings and sharing our expressions and supporting each other, the more that we will come into union with the collective consciousness I am presence that we all are anyway, and our sovereignty, which absolutely lights and shines the way to our true evolutionary path as a collective consciousness. I'm just saying it really beautifully. And that's our right. That's our divine right. So yeah, I hope it made sense. It's probably pretty intense, and because I'd already done a video, I couldn't remember what I'd said and what I hadn't said. So let's just hope it flows. But lots of love. Thank you so much for supporting. And it's getting dark now, but I'll show you. Beautiful. Bye.